The darkness you can't escape. Close your eyes right now. Go ahead, actually do it. Keep them closed for 30 seconds. In that darkness, you're safe. You know exactly where you are. You know that when you open your eyes, light will flood back in. You know your phone is within reach, glowing softly, ready to illuminate anything you need. You know that if you wanted to, you could flip a switch and banish every shadow from the room. Now imagine you can never open your eyes to light again. Imagine that darkness is your permanent reality every single night for your entire life. Imagine that every evening as the sun sets, you descend into a world where seeing becomes guessing, where every step is a gamble, and where the simple act of going to the bathroom could result in injury, humiliation, or both. This isn't a horror movie. This isn't a nightmare you wake up from. This was daily life for millions of people just 150 years ago. Your great-great-grandparents lived in a world we can barely comprehend today, a world where darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was a physical presence that invaded every aspect of existence. It changed how people ate, how they slept, how they raised children, how they stayed clean, how they stayed warm, and how they stayed sane. Today, we're going to do something different. We're not going to romanticize the Victorian era with images of gas-lit streets and elegant ballrooms. We're going to tell you the truth about what it was actually like to live without electricity. And I promise you, by the end of this, you will never take a light switch for granted again. You'll understand why something as simple as going to the bathroom at night was an ordeal that tested courage and coordination. You'll discover why families slept together not out of affection, but out of desperate necessity. You'll learn why Victorian children had that haunted look in photographs. And spoiler alert, it wasn't just the long exposure times. We're going to explore the psychological toll of living in constant semi-darkness, the physical dangers that lurked in every unlit corner, the economic calculations that governed every candle and every scrap of coal, and the social dynamics that formed when privacy was impossible and personal space was a luxury only the wealthy could afford. This is the story of how darkness shaped an entire civilization, how it influenced everything from architecture to family structure, from mental health to childhood development, from cooking techniques to courtship rituals. You're about to discover that the Victorians weren't just people living in the past. They were survivors of a world so fundamentally different from ours that understanding it requires us to completely reimagine what daily life means. They faced challenges every single day that would break most modern people within hours. They developed skills we've completely lost. They endured hardships we can't even properly imagine. And somehow, they not only survived but built the foundation of the modern world, all while stumbling through the darkness, one painful step at a time. So settle in, turn off some of your lights if you dare, and prepare to understand why the invention of the electric light bulb wasn't just a technological achievement. It was a revolution that freed humanity from a prison we'd been trapped in since the beginning of time. The prison of darkness. And once you understand what that prison was really like, you'll never see the Victorian era or your own life the same way again. Part 1. The Tyranny of Natural Light. Let's start at the beginning with something we take completely for granted, deciding when to wake up. In the modern world, we set alarms. We choose our wake-up time based on work schedules, personal preference, or how much we hate our jobs. The sun is irrelevant. We have blackout curtains. We have artificial light. We have complete control over our relationship with the day-night cycle. The Victorians had none of this. They were slaves to the sun in a way that's almost impossible for us to comprehend. Imagine your bedroom has a single window. It's not double-paned. It's not insulated. It's literally just a thin sheet of glass, sometimes not even that, sometimes it's oiled paper, separating you from the outside world. There are no curtains thick enough to block light, because thick fabric is expensive and you need every scrap you have for clothing and blankets. When the sun rises, light floods into your room whether you want it to or not. But here's what we don't understand about pre-modern life. You don't just wake up to light. You wake up to cold. Brutal, bone-deep cold that's been building all night as your meager fire died down to nothing. The Victorian morning is a sensory assault. Light stabs through your eyelids. Cold air hits your face like a slap. Your nose and ears are numb. Your breath creates visible clouds. And somewhere in the house, probably your mother or the house servant if your family is wealthy enough to have one, is already up, already working, already building the fire that will make the house barely tolerable for the next few hours. She's been up for hours. Not because she's a morning person, but because if she doesn't get the fire started early, the entire family might freeze. This is the first thing we need to understand about Victorian life. There was no such thing as leisure time in the morning. The moment consciousness returned, work began. Children who are 6, 7, 8 years old are expected to be up and contributing, making beds, fetching water, helping with younger siblings, starting their chores. The concept of sleeping in, of lazy Sunday mornings, of breakfast in bed, these are fantasies that exist only for the aristocracy, and even then, only because they have servants doing all the work they're supposedly avoiding. Let's talk about those servants for a moment, because they're invisible in most Victorian narratives, but they're absolutely central to understanding how the system worked. In a middle-class Victorian household, you might have 1 or 2 servants. These are usually young women, teenagers, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, who come from poorer families and are essentially sold into domestic service. They wake up at 4 or 5 in the morning, sometimes earlier. They light all the fires, haul all the water, prepare all the food, clean all the rooms, and do all of this in near total darkness for the first several hours of their day. Think about what this means psychologically. These girls, and they are girls, spend their teenage years waking up before dawn, working in the dark and cold, serving families who often treat them as less than human, all for wages that are barely enough to survive on. They sleep in unheated attic rooms. They eat leftover food. They have no privacy, no personal time, no prospects for advancement. And this is considered normal. This is considered a respectable occupation. The alternative is factory work, which is even worse, or prostitution, which is worse still, or starvation, which is the worst of all. But let's return to the family itself, because even in houses without servants, the morning routine reveals something dark about Victorian family dynamics. Privacy is impossible. A typical working-class family might have 4, 5, 6, sometimes 8 or more people living in a 2 or 3 room house. Everyone sleeps together. Everyone dresses together. Everyone performs their morning ablutions together. The concept of personal space simply doesn't exist. Children grow up never experiencing a moment alone. They don't have their own rooms. They don't have their own beds. They often don't even have their own clothes, wearing hand-me-downs and sharing garments with siblings. This creates a psychological environment that's completely foreign to modern people. Victorian children don't develop the same sense of individual identity that modern children do. They think of themselves primarily as members of a family unit, not as independent beings. This isn't because Victorians had different psychology. It's because their environment gave them no opportunity to develop independence. You can't have a private thought when you're never alone. You can't develop individual preferences when all resources are shared. You can't become your own person when survival depends on functioning as part of a collective. And here's something truly dark that historians often gloss over. The lack of light in the morning meant that personal hygiene was minimal at best. We imagine Victorians washing thoroughly, getting dressed properly, starting their day fresh and clean. The reality is that most people did a quick splash of ice-cold water on their face and hands, if they did that much. Full body washing was rare, maybe once a week if they were fortunate, maybe once a month or less if they weren't. They put on clothes that hadn't been washed in weeks or months. They didn't brush their teeth with anything resembling modern toothpaste. They didn't use deodorant because it didn't exist. So picture this: a family of 6 people, sleeping together in one bed, none of them having bathed recently, all of them wearing multiple layers of unwashed wool clothing, all of them waking up in a cold, dark room and immediately beginning the day's work without any of the morning rituals we consider basic hygiene. The smell alone would be overwhelming to a modern person. The Victorian world smelled like sweat, smoke, unwashed bodies, animal waste, and industrial pollution, all the time, everywhere, with no escape. This is why Victorian perfume was so heavy and why flowers were so important in Victorian culture. They weren't aesthetic choices. They were desperate attempts to mask the omnipresent stench of a world without running water, without sewers, without any of the infrastructure that makes modern cleanliness possible. The famous Victorian language of flowers wasn't romantic, it was practical. Flowers were communication devices, yes, but they were also portable air fresheners in a world that reeked of human misery. The morning also reveals the rigid gender dynamics that darkness enforced. Women and girls did the majority of the work in the dark hours because their labor was considered less valuable than men's. Men and boys might help with heavy lifting, but the endless tasks of fire building, water hauling, food preparation, child care, these all fell to females, often while trying to see by candlelight or the faint pre-dawn glow. This wasn't just sexism, though it was definitely that. It was also economics. Men's time was theoretically worth more because they were the ones who could work outside the home for wages. Women's domestic labor was unpaid and therefore free, which meant it could be expended lavishly without any apparent cost. This created a brutal cycle. Women worked longer hours than men, doing labor that was just as physically demanding, but because it happened in darkness and privacy, it was invisible and therefore valueless. The Victorian ideal of the delicate, fragile woman who spent her days doing needlework and swooning was a fantasy that applied to perhaps 1% of the female population. The other 99% were workhorses, grinding themselves down in the pre-dawn darkness, their contributions erased from history because no one thought their labor worth recording. And let's talk about the children again, because what happened to Victorian children in these dark mornings is genuinely disturbing. Children as young as 4 or 5 were given work to do, fetching small items, watching even younger children, holding candles for adults who needed both hands free. These tasks sound trivial until you realize what they meant. Children were being trained from the earliest possible age to suppress their own needs and desires in favor of family survival. They weren't playing. They weren't being educated in any formal sense. They were being broken in like animals, taught that their value lay solely in their usefulness, that their own comfort and happiness were irrelevant compared to the family's needs. This is why Victorian child mortality was so high. Yes, disease and malnutrition played roles, but so did exhaustion. Children were worked until their bodies gave out. They were sleep-deprived, malnourished, and expected to function as miniature adults from an age when modern children are still learning to tie their shoes. The ones who survived were the ones whose bodies could adapt to brutal conditions. Natural selection was still operating on human populations in the Victorian era, and it was selecting for the ability to endure suffering that would hospitalize a modern child. The morning also set the tone for the entire day. If the fire didn't light, if the water froze, if someone got sick, if any of 1,000 small things went wrong, the whole day could collapse into crisis. There was no calling in sick, no backup plan, no safety net. You pushed through or you suffered the consequences, which might mean going hungry, going cold, or failing to complete work that would cost you wages you desperately needed. Every morning was a high-stakes gamble, and the chips you were betting with were your family's survival. Part 2. The Architecture of Darkness. Now let's talk about the Victorian house itself, because the physical environment was specifically designed around the limitations of fire light and candle light, and understanding this design reveals just how completely darkness controlled every aspect of life. Modern houses are designed for artificial light. We have windows for view and ventilation, but we don't need them for illumination. Victorians had no choice. Every room had to be positioned to maximize natural light. which meant that house design was constrained in ways we can barely imagine. A typical Victorian middle-class house was built tall and narrow. Why? Because land was expensive and natural light only penetrates so far into a room. If you build wide, the center of the house becomes unusably dark. So Victorians built up, creating houses that were 3, 4, even 5 stories tall, with rooms stacked vertically. This seems quaint until you realize what it meant for daily life. Everything you needed might be on a different floor from where you were. Going from the kitchen to the bedroom meant climbing stairs in the dark. Moving laundry from the washroom to the drying area meant navigating multiple flights while carrying heavy, wet clothing, probably by candlelight, probably while exhausted. The famous Victorian townhouse, the kind you see in period dramas looking all elegant and sophisticated, was actually a nightmare of vertical inefficiency forced on people by the tyranny of darkness. Servants spent their entire days running up and down stairs because there was no other way to organize the household. The vertical structure also meant that heat, which rises, made the upper floors marginally warmer, but only if you could afford to keep a fire burning all day, which most families couldn't. Let's talk about windows. Victorian windows were large compared to medieval windows, but they were still terrible by modern standards. Single-pane glass, often wavy and distorted, installed in frames that were never quite airtight. They let in light, yes, but they also let in cold, let in drafts, let in noise, and let in pollution. In London and other industrial cities, the air was so thick with coal smoke that windows would be filthy within hours of cleaning. The famous London fog wasn't natural weather. It was industrial smog so thick you couldn't see across the street. This meant that even during the day, even with large windows, the inside of a house was dim, gray, and oppressive. Window glass was also expensive. This meant that lower-income families often couldn't afford to replace broken panes, so they stuffed the gaps with rags, paper, or wood, which of course blocked the light they so desperately needed. You can see the catch-22 here. You needed windows for light, but you also needed to keep out the cold, and you couldn't do both effectively. So you chose light and freeze or darkness and survive. Most people chose darkness and survival. The layout of rooms was also dictated by light. The best lit room, usually facing south or east to catch morning sun, was the main living area. This was where everything happened during the day: cooking, eating, working, socializing, everything. Other rooms were secondary, used only when absolutely necessary or when you could spare a candle. Bedrooms were often tiny and dark because you only needed to see enough to get in and out of bed. Storage rooms were kept deliberately dark to preserve food and protect fabric from fatting. This meant that Victorian life was incredibly compressed. A family might have a house with 8 or 10 rooms, but they actually lived in only 1 or 2 of them, spending the majority of their time in the kitchen or the main parlor simply because those were the only rooms with enough light to function. The rest of the house was like a cave system attached to the living space, a network of cold, dark chambers that you ventured into only when necessary and escaped from as quickly as possible. Now let's discuss the truly horrifying aspect of Victorian architecture: staircases in the dark. Victorian houses had steep, narrow staircases because space was at a premium. These stairs were death traps: polished wood steps, no handrails or minimal handrails, steep pitch, narrow width, and used constantly in near total darkness. Falls were common. Serious injuries were common. Deaths were not unheard of. Children, elderly people, and pregnant women were especially at risk. The simple act of going upstairs to bed was a legitimate hazard every single night. Think about what this meant for anyone with mobility issues. If you broke a leg, if you had arthritis, if you were heavily pregnant, navigating your own home became nearly impossible. There were no elevators, no ramps, no accessibility considerations whatsoever. If you couldn't manage stairs in the dark, you became trapped on whatever floor you could reach. This is part of why Victorian families often kept elderly relatives or sick family members in downstairs rooms, not out of consideration, but out of necessity. The stairs were simply too dangerous. The famous Victorian basement kitchen is another dark horror. Many Victorian houses had the kitchen in the basement or semi-basement, partly to keep cooking smells out of the main house, partly because that's where the servants worked and they needed to be kept separate from the family, and partly because that's where the coal storage and water access were located. This meant that the people preparing food, the most important task for family survival, were working in the worst light conditions in the entire house. Basement windows were small and high up, often at street level, which meant they were constantly dirty from street traffic, and they let in minimal light even at midday. Imagine trying to cook a complex meal in a room that's essentially a dimly lit cave. You're working with an open fire that provides some light but fills the room with smoke. You're trying to judge whether food is properly cooked by looking at it in flickering orange light that makes everything look the same color. You're using knives and other sharp implements in conditions where you can barely see your hands. And you're doing this for hours every day, meal after meal, year after year, slowly destroying your eyesight and risking injury with every cut and chop and stir. The Victorian obsession with curtains and drapes wasn't about privacy or decoration. It was about controlling cold. Those heavy velvet curtains we associate with Victorian style were insulation. You closed them at night to try to keep heat in and cold out. But this created another problem. During the day, you had to choose between light and warmth. Open curtains meant light but cold. Closed curtains meant warmer but darker. Most families compromised, keeping curtains partially closed and living in a perpetual twilight. Furniture placement was also dictated by light. The best chair, the one nearest the window, was the prime real estate where whoever was doing close work, sewing, reading, writing, would sit. Other family members had to make do with secondary positions. This created a literal hierarchy of illumination within the home, with the most important or most favored family member getting the best light while others worked in progressively worse conditions. Children doing homework would fight over spots near candles or windows. Women doing needlework, which required seeing fine detail, would strain their eyes trying to work in insufficient light, leading to headaches, vision problems, and permanent eye damage. The color schemes in Victorian houses were dark because light-colored walls and fabrics showed dirt too easily, and with the constant coal smoke and general grime, keeping anything light-colored clean was a losing battle. So Victorians lived in dark houses painted in dark colors, furnished with dark furniture, which made the light situation even worse. The famous Victorian aesthetic of dark wood, deep colors, and heavy fabrics wasn't a design choice. It was a practical necessity born from the impossibility of keeping anything clean in a world of coal fires and no electric lighting. Storage was another challenge. Without good lighting, finding things was difficult. Victorians developed elaborate organizational systems, keeping items in specific places so they could be located by touch and memory. Cupboards had multiple small drawers and compartments because you needed to be able to narrow down where something was without having to search through a large, dark space. This is why Victorian furniture is so compartmentalized, with dozens of small drawers and nooks. It's not about aesthetic charm. It's about solving the practical problem of finding objects when you can't see properly. The lack of lighting also meant that certain rooms were used only during specific times. A room that faced east might be used in the morning, but abandoned by afternoon as the light moved. This created a kind of nomadic existence within your own home, following the sun from room to room, setting up work in whatever space had the best light at that moment. The idea of having a dedicated office or workspace was impossible for most people because light conditions changed throughout the day. Part 3. The economics of illumination. Now we need to discuss something that might be the most disturbing aspect of Victorian darkness, the economic calculations that governed every moment of illuminated time. In the modern world, light is essentially free. Yes, electricity costs money, but the actual incremental cost of turning on a light is negligible. We don't think about it. We waste light constantly, leaving rooms lit when no one is in them, using way more illumination than we actually need. To a Victorian, this would be incomprehensible luxury, the equivalent of burning money just to watch it burn. Let's talk numbers. A typical tallow candle, the cheapest kind available, cost about 1 penny and would burn for approximately 2 to 3 hours. 1 penny doesn't sound like much until you realize that a working-class family's total income might be 10 to 15 shillings per week, which is 120 to 180 pence. If that family needed to light their home for just 4 hours per evening, that's 2 candles, which is 2 pence per day, which is 14 pence per week, which is roughly 10% of their total income. Now consider this. That's just for minimal lighting, probably 1 candle for the main living area and maybe one to carry for moving around the house. If they wanted to actually see well enough to do close work, read, study, anything requiring detailed vision, they'd need multiple candles or better quality candles, which cost more. So many families simply couldn't afford adequate lighting. They sat in darkness not because they wanted to, not because they were used to it, but because purchasing enough light to see properly would have meant not being able to afford food. This created a brutal choice that Victorian families faced every single day. Light or food, heat or light, clothing or light. Every penny spent on candles was a penny not spent on something else they desperately needed. And the calculation wasn't just about money, it was about survival. In winter, when days were short and darkness came early, families needed more light, but they also needed more food to stay warm, more coal for heat, more everything. The budget didn't stretch. Something had to give. Usually it was light. Let's make this concrete with an example. Imagine you're a Victorian seamstress working from home, doing piecework for a clothing manufacturer. You're paid per garment you complete. To complete a garment, you need to see what you're doing, which requires light. During summer, you can work by daylight for maybe 12 to 14 hours. During winter, you might only have 6 to 8 hours of usable daylight. If you want to work longer to earn more money, you need to light candles. But the cost of the candles might be more than the additional income you generate by working longer hours. So you're trapped. You can't afford to work, but you can't afford not to work. This is why Victorian workers had such poor eyesight. They weren't just straining to see in bad light. They were making an economic calculation that their eyesight was worth less than the cost of candles. They deliberately damaged their eyes to save money, knowing that by their 40s or 50s they might be functionally blind for close work. But the alternative was starving today, and today always won out over tomorrow. The wealthy had a completely different relationship with light. If you were truly rich, you could afford as many candles as you wanted. You could afford the expensive beeswax candles that burned cleaner and brighter than tallow. You could later afford gas lighting, which was brighter still. And eventually, you could afford to be among the first to install electric lighting. This created a literal illumination divide where the rich lived in relatively well-lit environments while the poor groped through darkness. This divide was visible and deliberate. When wealthy people held evening parties, they would light their houses extravagantly, with hundreds of candles burning simultaneously, purely as a display of wealth. The message was clear. We can afford to waste light while you ration every precious hour of illumination. This wasn't just showing off. It was a demonstration of power and social status, more effective than any words. Think about what this meant for children's education. Wealthy children could study in the evening by good candle light or gas light. Poor children had to stop learning when the sun went down because their families couldn't afford the candles for them to do homework. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a systematic barrier to social mobility. The darkness itself enforced class boundaries, making it nearly impossible for poor children to get the education that might lift them out of poverty. The economic pressure also created an entire industry of darkness mitigation strategies. People developed elaborate techniques for making candles last longer, for reflecting and magnifying available light, for organizing their time to maximize productive daylight hours. There were candle holders with reflective backs to direct light more efficiently. There were complex schedules governing which family members could use candles and when. There were social rules about borrowing fire from neighbors when your own went out. Speaking of borrowing fire, this was a whole cultural practice that reveals the economics of light. If your fire went completely out overnight, which happened regularly, you couldn't just flick a match and restart it. Matches were expensive and didn't always work. The reliable way to restart a fire was to go to a neighbor's house and borrow a burning coal or ember. You would carry it home in a pot lined with ashes, hoping it didn't go out on the way. This created a system of light debt and obligation. You owed your neighbor for the ember, and you were expected to return the favor when they needed it. This system sounds quaint until you realize what it meant. Your family's survival literally depended on maintaining good relationships with your neighbors. If you were ostracized, if you had feuded with everyone around you, if you were the community pariah, you might not be able to borrow fire, which meant you couldn't cook, couldn't heat your home, couldn't survive. The economics of light created a forced community interdependence that governed social behavior in ways we can barely imagine. The candle economy also created a whole criminal underworld. Candle theft was a real and serious crime. Servants were often accused of stealing candles from their employers. Children were punished for taking candle stubs. There were markets for stolen candles. This seems absurd until you remember that candles were expensive enough that stealing them was worth the risk of punishment. In the value system of the time, a candle theft was considered a serious offense, comparable to stealing food or money. The economics extended to every aspect of lighting. Oil for lamps was expensive. The lamps themselves were expensive and required maintenance. Wicks needed to be trimmed. Chimneys needed to be cleaned. Every component of every lighting system had a cost, both in money and in labor, and every family had to carefully balance these costs against their ability to pay and their need to see. This created bizarre situations where people would rather risk injury or illness than waste light. A person with a minor injury might not bother to properly examine and treat it because doing so would require lighting a candle. A person feeling ill might not look for medicine because the medicine cupboard was in a dark room and they couldn't justify the expense of taking a candle in there. These decisions seem insane until you understand the economic pressures that drove them. The wealthy could afford to be healthier, safer, and more productive simply because they could afford to see what they were doing. This created a feedback loop where wealth generated more wealth partly through access to better lighting. A wealthy merchant could work longer hours in better light, making better decisions with better information. A poor laborer worked in darkness and made mistakes that cost them money and opportunities. Let's also discuss the seasonal variation. In summer, when days were long, the cost of lighting was minimal because you could do most things by daylight. In winter, when days were short, lighting costs could triple or quadruple. This meant that winter wasn't just colder and darker, it was also more expensive, creating a season of compounding misery where every aspect of life became simultaneously harder and more costly. Families developed elaborate summer strategies to prepare for winter darkness. They would try to complete tasks during long summer days that could be stored for winter use. Sewing that could wait would be postponed to summer when it could be done by daylight. Reading and studying were summer activities. Winter was for activities that didn't require good vision. Sleeping more, doing rough work that could be done by touch, telling stories and talking rather than reading. This seasonal rhythm is completely foreign to modern life, where every day is essentially the same in terms of our ability to see and work. We've conquered seasonality through artificial light. Victorians lived in a world where summer and winter were almost like living in two different countries, one bright and relatively livable, one dark and desperately challenging. Part 4. The Psychology of Perpetual Gloom. Now we're going to venture into territory that Victorian historians often avoid because it's speculative and disturbing. What did living in constant semi-darkness do to people's mental health? We can't know for certain, but we can make educated guesses based on what we know about human psychology and what we can read in Victorian literature, diaries, and medical records. First, let's establish what we know about light and human psychology from modern science. Light exposure is crucial for mental health. Seasonal affective disorder, which causes depression during dark winter months, is a recognized medical condition treated with light therapy. Light regulates our circadian rhythms, affects our mood through hormones like serotonin, and is essential for cognitive function. People living in consistently poor lighting conditions show higher rates of depression, anxiety, and cognitive decline. Now imagine living your entire life with inadequate light, not just during winter but year-round, because even on the brightest summer day, the inside of a Victorian house was dimmer than the dimmest modern office. The psychological impact would have been enormous, and we see evidence of this in Victorian culture. The Victorian obsession with death, mourning, and melancholy wasn't just aesthetic. It was a reflection of a genuinely depressed culture living in genuinely depressing conditions. Victorian literature is full of darkness, literal and metaphorical. Dickens's London is a place of fog, shadows, and gloom. The Brontes write about wild moors and dark houses. Gothic literature flourishes in this period. Why? Partly because writers write about their environment, and their environment was dark, but also because the psychological state induced by living in darkness made people receptive to dark themes. When you spend every evening sitting in flickering firelight, your mind naturally turns to thoughts of mortality, ghosts, and the supernatural. The lack of good lighting also affected sleep patterns in ways that would have had psychological consequences. Modern humans have heavily disrupted circadian rhythms because of artificial light. Victorian humans had different but equally disrupted rhythms because of inconsistent light exposure. They didn't have regular light-dark cycles. Instead, they had a complex pattern of bright outdoor light during the day, dim indoor light in the morning and evening, and total darkness at night, but a darkness frequently interrupted by the need to tend fires, check on children, or use chamber pots. This meant Victorian sleep was terrible, fragmented, interrupted, insufficient. Sleep deprivation is one of the most effective forms of torture because it rapidly degrades mental health, cognitive function, and emotional regulation. Victorians were chronically sleep deprived, not because they chose to be, but because their environment made solid, restful sleep almost impossible. This would have contributed to anxiety, irritability, depression, and poor decision-making at a population level. Let's talk about children specifically, because what Victorian darkness did to developing brains is particularly disturbing. Modern child psychology tells us that children need security, routine, and a sense of control over their environment to develop healthy emotional regulation. Victorian children had none of this. They lived in houses where danger lurked in every dark corner, where they were constantly told to be quiet, to be useful, to suppress their needs. They went to bed in rooms so dark they couldn't see their own hands, often in beds crowded with siblings, often cold, often hungry, always uncertain whether they'd be safe through the night. The psychological impact of this is staggering. These children were being taught that the world was dark, dangerous, and uncontrollable. They learned helplessness at an early age because there was genuinely nothing they could do to improve their situation. Is it any wonder that Victorian adults were so stoic, so resigned, so apparently emotionless? They'd had emotion beaten out of them by an environment that punished any expression of personal needs or desires. Victorian ghost stories and supernatural beliefs also make sense in this context. When you live in darkness, when shadows move and flicker constantly, when you literally cannot see what's in the corner of your room, the human brain fills in the gaps. We're wired to see patterns and detect threats. In a dark Victorian house, your brain would be constantly on alert, constantly interpreting shadows as potential dangers. After years of this, the line between real and imagined threats would become blurred. You'd believe in ghosts not because you were superstitious, but because your brain, starved of clear visual information, created them. The Victorian obsession with order, cleanliness, and moral rectitude can also be understood as a psychological response to living in chaos. When your physical environment is dark, dirty, and dangerous, you compensate by creating rigid mental structures. You develop elaborate rules for behavior, strict moral codes, obsessive attention to propriety and manners. This gives you a sense of control in a world where you control almost nothing. The famous Victorian prudishness wasn't about sexual repression. It was about creating a framework of certainty and predictability in lives defined by uncertainty and unpredictability. Mental illness was epidemic in Victorian England, though it was rarely diagnosed or treated effectively. Asylums were full of people who had broken down under the strain of Victorian life. Many of these people were probably suffering from conditions we would now recognize as depression, anxiety, PTSD, and other disorders directly caused or exacerbated by their living conditions. But because Victorians didn't understand the link between environment and mental health, they attributed these conditions to moral weakness, hereditary defects, or demonic influence. Women were particularly vulnerable to mental health problems, partly because they spent more time indoors in bad lighting, partly because they had even less control over their lives than men did. The Victorian diagnosis of hysteria, which was applied almost exclusively to women, was probably a catch-all term for depression, anxiety, and legitimate responses to impossible situations. Women were told they were sick for reacting normally to abnormal circumstances. They were confined to dark rooms, told to rest, and sometimes subjected to treatments that made their conditions worse. The psychological impact of darkness also affected family dynamics. When you can't see people's faces clearly, when most interactions happen in dim light or flickering shadows, you lose a crucial channel of emotional communication. Facial expressions, body language, subtle cues, all of these are harder to read in poor light. This would have made Victorian family relationships both more intense, because you were physically close all the time, and more distant, because you couldn't actually see each other clearly. The emotional disconnection we sense in Victorian photographs and letters might not just be cultural reserve. It might be a genuine difficulty in reading and expressing emotions in an environment that literally obscured faces. The darkness also created a kind of enforced intimacy that modern people would find intolerable. You were always aware of other people's presence, their breathing, their movements, their bodily functions. Privacy was impossible. This meant Victorian people developed very different boundaries than modern people. Things that would embarrass us were routine for them, not because they were shameless, but because they had no choice. You can't be modest about chamber pots when the entire family uses the same one and empties it together. This forced intimacy had dark implications. Sexual abuse, domestic violence, and child abuse were probably significantly more common than Victorian society admitted, partly because the darkness provided cover. Bruises are harder to see in dim light. Fear and distress are easier to hide when no one can see your face clearly. The Victorian home, dark and crowded, was a perfect environment for hidden horrors to flourish. We know from what records survive that these problems existed, but they were almost certainly massively underreported because the darkness itself helped conceal them. Let's also consider the cognitive effects of poor lighting. Modern research shows that inadequate light exposure affects learning, memory formation, and decision-making. Victorian children trying to learn to read by candlelight were fighting against their own neurology. Their brains literally couldn't function optimally in those conditions. This meant that education was less effective, skills were harder to acquire, and cognitive development was probably impaired across the entire population. The Victorians weren't less intelligent than modern people, but they were working with brains that were chronically understimulated by poor visual input. The darkness affected how people thought about time and space. Modern people have a very precise sense of time because we can always check clocks, and because our days are rigidly structured by work schedules and appointments. Victorian people, especially working-class people, had a much more fluid sense of time. Without good lighting to work by, the length of your productive day varied with the seasons. Time wasn't an abstract measure. It was tied directly to available light. This created a different relationship with productivity and leisure. You worked when you could see, you rested when you couldn't, and clock time was less important than solar time. The spatial sense was also affected. In darkness, distances feel different. Rooms feel larger and more threatening. The same house that feels cozy by daylight becomes a maze of potential dangers at night. Victorian people had to maintain two mental maps of their homes, the daylight version and the night version, and learn to navigate both. This cognitive load, the constant need to reorient yourself when lighting conditions changed, would have been exhausting and would have taken mental resources away from other tasks. We should also discuss seasonal variation in mental health. The long dark winters must have been psychologically devastating. Imagine living through a British winter with no central heating, no electric light, no ability to escape the darkness except by sleeping more. Depression rates must have spiked every winter, even if it wasn't recognized or diagnosed. Suicides probably increased. Domestic violence probably increased. Alcohol consumption definitely increased, partly as a coping mechanism for the psychological stress of enduring months of darkness and cold. The Victorians self-medicated extensively. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was freely available and widely used for everything from teething bobbies to menstrual cramps to insomnia. The Victorian epidemic of opiate addiction was partly about pain management in an era before modern medicine, but it was also about mental health. People were using opiates to numb the psychological pain of lives spent in darkness, cold, and deprivation. The famous Victorian stiff upper lip wasn't stoicism. It was dissociation induced by chronic stress and often enhanced by chemical assistance. Part 5. The Machinery of Darkness Survival. Now let's examine the actual practical techniques Victorians developed to survive in darkness, because understanding these techniques reveals both human ingenuity and human desperation. Victorians weren't passive victims of the dark. They were active problem solvers who developed elaborate systems to manage life without light. Some of these systems were brilliant. Some were dangerous. All of them reveal a level of skill and knowledge that we've completely lost. Fire management was the foundational skill of Victorian survival, and it was far more complex than modern people realize. Building and maintaining a fire isn't just about striking a match, which didn't always work reliably anyway. It's about understanding wood types, draft patterns, moisture content, layering techniques, and timing. A Victorian housewife could tell by looking at wood whether it would burn hot or smoky, fast or slow. She could build a fire that would last exactly as long as needed, producing the right amount of heat and light without wasting precious fuel. The technique of banking a fire for overnight survival was particularly crucial. Before bed, you would arrange coals in a specific pattern, cover them with ash to slow combustion, and hope they'd stay alive until morning when you could revive them. This was genuinely skilled work. Too much ash and the fire died completely, meaning a morning crisis. Too little and the fire burned through the night, wasting fuel you couldn't afford to waste. Getting it exactly right required experience, attention to detail, and a bit of luck. Children learned this skill from early age because everyone needed to know how to manage fire. It wasn't optional knowledge, it was survival skill. Candle making was another lost art. Poor families couldn't afford to buy all their candles, so they made them from kitchen waste fat. Saving every scrap of grease, melting it down, straining out impurities, preparing wicks from twisted cotton or flax, pouring the hot tallow into molds or repeatedly dipping wicks to build up layers. This was time-consuming, smelly, messy work that produced candles that were inferior to purchased ones, but it was necessary. A family might spend an entire day several times a year making candles to supplement what they could afford to buy. The children who grew up doing this knew the value of every candle because they'd literally made them with their own hands. Navigation techniques in darkness were also sophisticated. Victorian people developed extraordinary spatial memory and tactile senses. They could move through familiar spaces in complete darkness by counting steps, feeling for landmarks, and using subtle cues like temperature changes and air currents to orient themselves. Blind people have always known these techniques, but sighted Victorians had to develop them too because they spent so much time in conditions where sight was useless. Furniture was often deliberately arranged to create a kind of pathway through a room. You knew that if you felt the edge of the table and turned left, 3 steps would bring you to the chair. If you felt the door frame with your right hand, the staircase was straight ahead. This meant that rearranging furniture was actually dangerous because it disrupted these mental maps. Victorian rooms stayed static not because people weren't creative with interior design, but because changing the layout meant weeks of dangerous stumbling until new patterns were learned. Clothing storage was organized by touch as much as sight. Garments were kept in specific drawers or on specific hooks, always in the same place, so they could be found in darkness. The texture of different fabrics served as identification. Wool felt different from cotton, felt different from linen. You could dress entirely by touch if you needed to, grabbing items by their familiar texture and location. This is why Victorian wardrobes had so many small compartments. It wasn't about organization for organization's sake. It was about creating a tactile filing system. Sound became incredibly important in darkness. Victorian people listened constantly, using sounds to navigate and stay safe. They could identify family members by their footsteps, tell what room someone was in by the sounds they made, detect problems like water dripping or fire smoking by subtle auditory cues. The ability to interpret sounds was a crucial survival skill. A good Victorian mother could hear the difference between a child sleeping soundly and a child pretending to sleep. She could hear whether the fire was burning properly without looking at it. She could hear whether it was starting to rain before anyone could see it. Time telling without clocks was another developed skill. Most working-class families didn't own clocks, or if they did, they couldn't see them in the dark anyway. So they told time by other means, by how hungry they felt, by how low the candle had burned, by the angle of sunlight through the window during the day, by the sounds of the neighborhood waking or settling. Church bells marking hours were crucial for people who had no other way to know what time it was. This created a community-synchronized time sense, where everyone regulated their activities by shared audible signals. Food preservation techniques were also adapted to darkness. Root cellars and pantries were deliberately kept dark and cold to preserve food, but this meant finding and retrieving food required navigating dark spaces. Victorians developed elaborate mental inventories of what was stored where. A good housekeeper could find any item in her pantry in the dark by knowing exactly where she'd placed it and how it felt to the touch. Jars were distinguished by size and shape. Sacks of flour and sugar and salt were identified by weight and texture. This organizational skill was taught to children and considered an essential mark of household competence. Social codes developed around darkness management. There were rules about who could use candles when, about how you carried light safely in a crowded house, about warning people before moving through dark spaces so you didn't collide with them. These rules were unwritten but universally understood. Breaking them was a serious social error that could lead to genuine consequences like injuries, fires, or wasted resources. The technique of communal lighting deserves special attention. When families gathered in the evening, they didn't each have their own light source. They shared 1 or maybe 2 candles, carefully positioning themselves to make best use of the available light. The person doing the finest work got the best position. Others made do with reflected or peripheral light. This required cooperation and consideration. Children learned to stay still so their shadows didn't block someone else's light. Adults learned to position themselves so everyone could see adequately. This communal approach to light was enforced by economics, but it also created social bonds. You literally couldn't live in Victorian darkness alone. You needed your family's cooperation to survive. Seasonal adaptation techniques were highly developed. In winter, families contracted their living space, abandoning outer rooms and concentrating in the warmest, best-lit areas. This wasn't giving up. It was a strategic retreat that made survival possible. In summer, they expanded again, using every room and taking advantage of long days to catch up on work that couldn't be done in winter. This accordion pattern of expansion and contraction required significant logistical planning. You couldn't just leave summer rooms closed all winter. You had to prepare them, protect stored items from cold and damp, and plan for the spring reopening. Emergency protocols for when light failed were well established. If all candles were gone and the fire had died, you didn't panic. You followed a procedure. Send someone to borrow fire from a neighbor. Keep everyone together in one room for warmth and safety. Use saved candle stubs if absolutely necessary. Wait for daylight if possible. These protocols were taught to children and practiced regularly enough that everyone knew what to do when crisis struck. And crisis struck often because the systems were fragile and failures were common. Medical care in darkness was particularly challenging and required special techniques. Checking for fever meant touching the forehead because you couldn't rely on visual assessment. Examining injuries required bringing the injury to the light source, not the other way around, because candles were too precious and too dangerous to move unnecessarily. Home surgery, and yes, minor surgery was often performed at home, required careful preparation to ensure adequate light, usually by positioning the patient near a window during daylight hours or arranging multiple candles for nighttime emergencies. Childbirth in darkness was genuinely terrifying. Midwives developed techniques for delivering babies by touch and sound as much as sight, because births don't wait for convenient lighting. They could assess labor progress by feeling contractions, could deliver a baby in conditions where they could barely see what they were doing, could tie off umbilical cords and clear airways working largely by touch. The infant mortality rate was horrifying partly because of medical ignorance, but also partly because these procedures were being performed in conditions where a modern doctor would refuse to operate. Part 6. The Invisible Labor of Darkness 7200-8700. We need to discuss something that Victorian historians consistently overlook: the sheer amount of additional labor that darkness created and who performed that labor. Every task took longer in poor light. Everything was harder. Nothing came easy. And the burden of this extra work fell disproportionately on certain people: women, children, servants, and the poor. Let's start with water, because water is life, and getting water in Victorian times was a Herculean labor that had to be performed mostly in darkness. A family of 6 might need 30 to 50 gallons of water per day for drinking, cooking, washing, and cleaning. This water had to be hauled from a well, a pump, or a stream, carried home in buckets, often upstairs, and then distributed to where it was needed. A gallon of water weighs about 8 pounds. 50 gallons is 400 pounds. Imagine carrying 400 pounds of water every day, making multiple trips because you can't carry it all at once, navigating by darkness or dim light, climbing stairs, trying not to spill because every drop is precious. This work was gendered. Women and girls fetched water almost exclusively. They got up before dawn while it was still dark and made their first water run. They made additional runs throughout the day as water was used. In winter, they might find the pump frozen and have to thaw it. The well might ice over. Their hands would crack and bleed from the cold and wet. They developed permanent damage to their backs and shoulders from years of carrying water. And all of this was considered so normal, so unremarkable, that it barely appears in historical records. It was invisible labor performed by invisible people in the darkness before anyone else woke up. Food preparation was similarly labor-intensive and darkness-dependent. Cooking a simple meal from scratch, which was the only option because processed food didn't exist, could take hours. Bread had to be made from flour, yeast, salt, and water, kneaded by hand, left to rise, baked in an oven that had to be maintained at the right temperature through careful fire management. Meat had to be butchered, cleaned, seasoned, cooked slowly to make tough cuts tender. Vegetables had to be scrubbed, peeled, chopped. Everything was done by hand, usually by poorly lit hand, and the work never ended. A Victorian housewife or cook might spend 8 to 12 hours a day just on food preparation and cleanup. She started before dawn, preparing breakfast in the dark. She spent the middle of the day preparing lunch and dinner. She spent the evening cleaning up and preparing for tomorrow. She got help from children or servants if the family could afford them, but she still bore the responsibility. And all of this work was undervalued because it was considered woman's work, natural work, not real labor. Cleaning in darkness was almost Sisyphean. You couldn't see what you were cleaning. You couldn't see whether you'd actually removed the dirt or just spread it around. You had to clean by touch and by faith, scrubbing areas you couldn't clearly see and hoping you'd done an adequate job. The famous Victorian obsession with cleanliness wasn't neurotic. It was necessary, because dirt in a dark house was invisible until it became a health hazard. You had to clean aggressively and constantly, just to stay ahead of the filth you couldn't see. Laundry deserves its own extended discussion, because it was probably the single most physically demanding task in the Victorian household, and it was all made worse by darkness. Washing clothes meant hauling water, heating water, making or buying soap, scrubbing each garment by hand on a washboard until your knuckles bled, wringing everything out by hand until your hands cramped, hanging everything to dry, taking it down, and possibly ironing it with heavy irons heated on the stove. A full laundry day could take 12 to 16 hours of brutal physical labor, usually performed by women and girls, often starting before dawn and ending after dark. The darkness made every step harder. Sorting laundry by color in poor light meant mistakes that ruined clothes. Judging whether items were actually clean required bringing them to better light. Hanging clothes to dry in the dark meant repeatedly banging into wet fabric. The work was cold, wet, exhausting, and endless, because clothes got dirty constantly and there was no alternative to washing by hand. Child care in darkness was particularly challenging. Modern parents rely on baby monitors, night lights, visual checks to ensure their children are safe. Victorian parents had none of this. They checked on sleeping children in complete darkness, hopping to feel breath without waking the child. They changed diapers, cloth diapers in the dark, washing their hands when they could but often just wiping them clean. They soothed crying bobbies without being able to see what was wrong. They did all of this while exhausted, while possibly responsible for multiple other children, while trying not to wake the whole household. Breastfeeding in the dark presented its own challenges. Positioning a baby correctly, ensuring the baby was actually feeding and not just sleeping on the breast, watching for signs of distress, all of this was harder without being able to see clearly. New mothers learned to nurse by touch, developing a sensitivity to the baby's movements and sounds that substituted for sight. It worked mostly, but it was stressful and required skills that modern mothers with their well-lit nurseries never need to develop. Sewing and mending, crucial tasks for families who couldn't afford to replace worn clothing, were extremely difficult in poor light. Threading needles in candlelight strained the eyes brutally. Seeing fine stitches, matching colors, creating even seams, all of these required excellent light, and most Victorian women simply didn't have it. They worked in inadequate light and ruined their eyesight doing it. By their 40s, many women who'd spent their lives sewing in poor light were effectively blind for close work, unable to continue the very labor that had blinded them. The economic value of all this invisible labor is staggering. If you tried to calculate the number of work hours Victorian women spent on tasks that are now mechanized or eliminated, you'd find that they were working the equivalent of 2 or 3 full-time jobs every day. Hauling water alone might be 2 to 3 hours daily. Food preparation might be 6 to 8 hours. Cleaning might be 3 to 4 hours. Laundry on laundry days might be 12 to 16 hours. Child care was continuous. All of this labor was unpaid, unrecognized, and performed in conditions that would be illegal under modern labor laws. And here's the truly dark part. This labor was what kept families alive. If women stopped doing this work, children died, husbands died, the whole family collapsed. So the work had to be done no matter how exhausting, no matter how damaging to the woman doing it, no matter how unfair the distribution of labor was. Victorian women were trapped in a system that required them to work themselves to death to keep their families alive, and the darkness made every aspect of that work harder. Servants experienced even worse conditions. They did all the same labor that housewives did, plus additional tasks for a family that wasn't theirs, for wages that were barely enough to survive on, with no days off, no privacy, and no prospects for improvement. A Victorian maid might get up at 4 or 5 in the morning, work until midnight, sleep in an unheated attic room, eat leftovers, and do it all again the next day. She performed all this labor in the worst light conditions in the house, because she worked in the earliest morning and latest evening hours when natural light was non-existent. The psychological damage this caused is incalculable. These women, often just girls really, teenagers or young adults, spent their formative years in a state of constant exhaustion, performing grinding labor in darkness and isolation, with no hope of escape. Many of them were sexually exploited by male employers or other members of the household. Many became pregnant and were dismissed without references, left to survive however they could. The darkness covered these crimes as effectively as it covered everything else. We need to also discuss the particular burden darkness placed on disabled people. If you were blind in Victorian times, you were actually at less of a disadvantage than you might think, because you developed the skills that everyone needed in darkness. But if you were mobility impaired, if you needed crutches or a wheelchair, you were essentially trapped. You couldn't navigate dark spaces safely. You couldn't flee from danger. You couldn't perform many of the tasks required for survival. Victorian society had no accommodations for disability. If you couldn't work, you either depended on family charity, which was often grudging and inadequate, or you ended up in a workhouse, which was essentially a prison for the poor and disabled. Elderly people faced similar challenges. As eyesight failed with age, as joints became arthritic, as memory declined, navigating a dark Victorian house became increasingly dangerous. Falls were common and often fatal because there was no way to make the environment safe for someone with age-related impairments. Old people were valued if they could still contribute labor, tolerated if they couldn't but had family to care for them, and discarded if they had neither. The darkness didn't discriminate, but it particularly punished those who were already vulnerable. Part 7. The Social Architecture of Darkness. The darkness didn't just affect individual families. It shaped entire communities and created social structures that are alien to modern experience. Victorian social life was organized around light and darkness in ways that determined everything from courtship to crime, from religion to recreation. Let's start with the daily rhythm of the community. Victorian towns and cities didn't have street lighting in the modern sense. Some wealthy areas had gas lights, but most streets were dark after sunset. This meant that nighttime was genuinely dangerous. Crime rates spiked after dark because criminals could operate with near impunity in the blackness. The famous Victorian fog that appears in so many period dramas wasn't just atmospheric effect. It was a genuine public safety crisis that made urban nights so dark and disorienting that legitimate business essentially stopped. This created a hard division between day life and night life. Respectable people stayed indoors after dark. Those who had to be out, night watchmen, doctors, some workers, were viewed with suspicion. Nighttime activity was associated with criminality and immorality. Prostitutes worked at night partly because darkness provided cover. Thieves operated at night for the same reason. This wasn't just Victorian prudishness. It was a rational response to the fact that darkness genuinely made cities dangerous in ways we can barely imagine. Public spaces were transformed by darkness. A market square that teemed with activity during daylight became empty and threatening at night. Parks and public gardens were completely off limits after dark because no sane person would enter an unlit open space where attackers could hide. Even main streets were risky. The modern concept of nightlife, of going out in the evening for entertainment and socializing, simply didn't exist for most Victorians. When the sun set, you went home and stayed there. This had profound implications for social class. The wealthy could afford to light their homes adequately and travel by private carriage with lamps, so they could maintain social lives in the evening. The poor couldn't, so their socializing was limited to daylight hours or to gathering in cramped, dark homes. This created a class-based division of time, where the rich owned the night and the poor were confined to darkness and isolation. Religious life was also shaped by light cycles. Church services were held during daylight hours when possible because lighting a church adequately was expensive and difficult. Night services existed for special occasions, but they required significant resources. This meant that religious community, which was central to Victorian social life, was primarily a daytime activity. The famous evening church services we think of as traditional are actually a later development made possible by better lighting. Courtship and marriage were heavily influenced by darkness. Young people had limited opportunities to spend time together because meeting in the dark was inappropriate, suggesting sexual impropriety. Chaperone visits during daylight hours were the norm. This wasn't just about controlling female sexuality, though that was part of it. It was also practical. Families needed to see who was courting their daughters to assess character and suitability, and you couldn't do that in darkness. The whole elaborate system of Victorian courtship rules was partly a response to the simple fact that unobserved meetings in darkness were assumed to be sexual, because there was no other reason to meet in the dark. Education was similarly constrained. School hours had to align with daylight because teaching in dim classrooms was ineffective and dangerous. This meant school days were longer in summer and shorter in winter, creating a seasonal rhythm to education that modern year-round schooling has eliminated. It also meant that working-class children who had to help their families during precious daylight hours had fewer opportunities for education, creating another mechanism by which darkness enforced class divisions. The legal system reflected darkness awareness. Curfews were common and enforced because nighttime activity was presumed to be criminal. Laws about carrying lights after dark existed in many jurisdictions. There were regulations about how businesses could operate in the evening, reflecting both safety concerns and the difficulty of supervising workers in poor light. The whole legal apparatus acknowledged that darkness created conditions requiring special rules. Neighborhood structure was also influenced by light needs. Houses were built close together partly for mutual protection, but also for practical reasons like borrowing fire and sharing resources. The geographic layout of Victorian neighborhoods created communities that were physically tighter than modern suburbs. You knew your neighbors intimately because you depended on them for everything from borrowed fire to emergency help in the night. This created strong community bonds, but also intense social pressure. Everyone knew everyone else's business because privacy was impossible in the close quarters required by darkness survival. Public health was dramatically affected by the relationship between darkness and sanitation. Sewers, where they existed, were maintained poorly partly because inspecting and repairing them in darkness was nearly impossible. Streets were cleaned inadequately because street cleaners worked by whatever light they had. Disease spread more rapidly in darkness because unsanitary conditions couldn't be seen and therefore weren't addressed. The famous Victorian public health crisis wasn't just about ignorance of germ theory. It was also about the practical impossibility of maintaining sanitation in adequate darkness. Urban planning, such as it existed, had to account for light limitations. Building heights were regulated partly to ensure that streets got some sunlight. The spacing of buildings, the width of streets, the placement of public buildings, all of these decisions were influenced by the need to maximize available natural light. The Victorian city was designed around light scarcity in ways that modern cities, designed around car traffic and zoning, simply aren't. Entertainment and culture were transformed by light restrictions. Theater performances had to happen during daylight or required expensive lighting, making theater a primarily upper-class entertainment. Music halls and variety shows that catered to working-class audiences operated in poorly lit conditions, which contributed to their rowdy, disreputable atmosphere. Reading was a daytime or expensive evening activity, creating a division between those who could afford to read at night and those who couldn't, which contributed to literacy gaps and class divides. Sports and recreation were daytime activities by necessity. The idea of night baseball or evening football matches was unthinkable. This meant that working people who labored during daylight hours had very limited opportunities for organized recreation. The Victorian obsession with Sunday as a day of rest wasn't just religious, it was also practical. Sunday was when working people had daylight hours available for anything other than labor. The pub culture that was so important in Victorian England makes more sense when you understand lighting. Pubs were among the few public spaces that were relatively well lit in the evenings, because pub owners could afford to light their establishments and could pass the cost on to customers through drink prices. For working class men, the pub was often the only place they could socialize in adequate light. Yes, alcohol was part of the attraction, but so was light, warmth, and community. The Victorian temperance movement was fighting not just against alcohol, but against one of the few sources of evening socialization available to the poor. Political organizing was affected by light limitations. Evening meetings required resources for lighting. Workers who needed to be up before dawn couldn't attend late meetings. This meant that political power was concentrated among those who controlled daylight hours and had resources for evening activities, which was, not coincidentally, the wealthy. The labor movement had to overcome these practical barriers just to organize workers, and the difficulty of meeting after dark was a genuine impediment to collective action. Crime was obviously shaped by darkness. Victorian crime statistics show clear patterns of nighttime crime, not because criminals were nocturnal by nature, but because darkness provided cover. Burglary, assault, murder, all spiked after dark. This created a cycle where darkness bred crime, which created fear, which kept legitimate people indoors, which made darkness even more dangerous because there were fewer witnesses and more opportunity. Policing in darkness was rudimentary at best. Night watchmen carried lanterns that announced their presence, effectively warning criminals to hide or flee. Modern policing with flashlights and street lighting made law enforcement incomparably more effective. Victorian police were often dealing with crimes that had happened hours earlier in complete darkness with no witnesses and no ability to investigate crime scenes effectively. Conclusion: the liberation of light. Now we need to understand what happened when electric light finally arrived and why it was genuinely revolutionary in ways that go far beyond the obvious. The introduction of electric lighting didn't just make houses brighter, it fundamentally restructured human society, human psychology, and human potential. When Thomas Edison demonstrated the electric light bulb in 1879, he wasn't just inventing a product. He was offering liberation from a prison that humanity had been trapped in since we first learned to use fire. Electric light meant that, for the first time in human history, darkness could be completely banished. You didn't have to manage fire or ration candles, or accept that half your life would be spent in dangerous semi-darkness. You flipped a switch and there was light, reliable light, safe light, abundant light. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Imagine living your entire life in the Victorian gloom we've described, and then one day, someone installs electric lights in your home. Suddenly, every room is visible. Every corner is accessible. You can move through your house without fear. You can read whenever you want. You can work in the evening. You can see your family's faces clearly. The relief, the liberation, the sheer joy of this would be overwhelming. But the social impacts were even more profound. Electric light eliminated the darkness advantage that had protected crime, revolutionizing public safety. It eliminated the daytime limitation on economic activity, allowing factories and businesses to operate profitably at night. It eliminated the seasonal variation in work hours, creating the modern concept of consistent shifts and standardized time. It eliminated the light-based class distinction, giving working people access to the same evening hours that the wealthy had always enjoyed. For women, electric light was particularly liberating. It reduced the labor required for light management, freeing up hours every day. It made evening work possible, creating opportunities for education and employment that hadn't existed before. It made homes safer, reducing the injuries and accidents that had been constant threats. It made child care easier by allowing mothers to see their children clearly at all hours. The reduction in women's domestic burden that began with electric light was one of the key factors that eventually led to women's broader social liberation. For children, electric light meant better education, safer homes, more time for play and development, and a chance to reach their full potential instead of being ground down by darkness and labor. The 20th century explosion in educational achievement and intellectual development wasn't just about better schools. It was also about better lighting that made studying and reading accessible to everyone. The speed of adoption varied by class and location. Wealthy urban homes got electric light in the 1880s and 1890s. Middle-class urban homes followed in the early 1900s. Rural and working-class areas didn't get reliable electric service until the 1920s, 30s, or even 40s in some places. This created a transitional period where some people were still living in Victorian darkness, while others had moved into the modern world. The social and economic implications of this unequal access were profound and are still echoing today. But here's what we need to understand about the modern world. We have completely forgotten what life was like before electric light. We take it so completely for granted that we can't even imagine alternatives. When the power goes out, we're helpless, anxious, and desperate to restore it as quickly as possible because we've lost all the skills and adaptations that let Victorians survive in darkness. We are, in a sense, more dependent on light than Victorians were because they had backups and we don't. This presents a disturbing question. What would happen if electric power became unavailable for an extended period? A cyber attack, a natural disaster, infrastructure failure, any number of scenarios could plunge us back into darkness. Unlike our Victorian ancestors, we wouldn't know how to manage. We don't know how to build and maintain fires. We don't have candles or oil lamps. We don't know how to navigate by memory and touch. We don't have the social systems and community bonds that made Victorian darkness survival possible. We would be helpless in a way that Victorians, for all their suffering, were not. This is perhaps the final lesson of Victorian darkness. It taught resilience, it taught community, it taught skills and adaptations that allowed survival in impossible conditions. We've gained enormous benefits from electric light, but we've also lost something. We've lost the knowledge of how to live without it, and we've lost the social bonds that formed when people needed each other to survive. So as you go about your modern life, flipping switches without thinking, leaving lights on in empty rooms, taking illumination completely for granted, remember your Victorian ancestors. Remember what they endured. Remember the skills they developed. Remember the price they paid in health, in comfort, in opportunities, in lives. Remember that electric light isn't just a convenience, it's a miracle that freed humanity from thousands of years of darkness. And maybe, just maybe, learn some of those old skills. Learn to build a fire. Learn to navigate in darkness. Learn to depend on your neighbors. Because the Victorian darkness taught us something that we've forgotten in our bright, modern world. That humans can endure almost anything if they work together, that darkness can be survived, and that the skills and bonds formed in hardship are worth preserving even when hardship is no longer necessary. The Victorian era ended more than a century ago, but its lessons about darkness, resilience, and human adaptability are still relevant. We live in a world of abundance that would seem like magic to our Victorian ancestors, but we're also more fragile, more dependent, more isolated than they were. Finding the balance between modern comfort and Victorian resilience might be one of the crucial challenges of our time. The darkness shaped them. The light has shaped us. Understanding both helps us understand who we are, where we came from, and what we're capable of enduring. That's the hidden truth of Victorian daily life, and it's a truth worth remembering even as we reach for the light switch one more time.